The genetically enhanced superhuman cadet struggled against his restraints, blood trickling from his mouth as the Suliban interrogators amped up the neural torture. Gerald Miller screamed in agony, knowing the Academy's hardline anti-Psi stance meant a swift death sentence if his illegal abilities were discovered. But even as his body convulsed, a fierce determination burned inside him. He would prove humanity's worth to these arrogant alien bastards, no matter the cost. Gerald was the lone human student at the prestigious Suliban Military Academy. He had fought tooth and nail for the chance to represent Earth among the galaxy's elite, only to be dismissed as a primitive curiosity by his classmates. Top of the class was Alara, daughter of the Suliban's most powerful general. She made no secret of her disdain for humanity's inferiority. But what Alara and the others didn't know was that Gerald possessed psionic abilities that surpassed anything their bio-augmented bodies could achieve. Abilities that came from illicit genetic engineering back on Earth. If discovered, he'd be expelled and likely executed. So he hid them, enduring humiliation and scorn, biding his time. Now, an academy-wide competition was approaching. It was Gerald's chance to show the galaxy what humanity was capable of. He trained in secret to master his powers, pushing himself harder than he ever imagined possible, because he knew the stakes were higher than his own life. Tensions simmered between humanity and the Suliban, and hardliners like Alara's father were eager for an excuse to put Earth in its place. If Gerald failed, it could mean disastrous consequences for his species. And as he overheard Alara and her lackeys plotting to sabotage his efforts, he knew the deck was stacked against him. The young cadet steeled himself for the trials ahead. On a galactic stage, judged by alien eyes, he would have to be faster, smarter, and stronger than ever before. And if unleashing his full psionic potential was the only path to victory, then so be it, even if it meant exposing his deepest secret. For the sake of humanity, failure was not an option. The first rounds of the competition were a disaster for Gerald. In the strategic simulation, his pod fed him false data, leading him to make one critical mistake after another. His virtual troops were massacred, his bases destroyed. He banged his hand against the pod in frustration, knowing Alara was behind this. Next came the Advanced Technology Challenge. Gerald reached for his tools, only to find them damaged and useless. Sabotage again. He did his best to improvise, but his half-functioning device sparked and smoked pathetically. The Suliban cadets laughed and jeered as his score tumbled. But Gerald refused to be broken. The physical combat trials were next, and he was determined to prove himself. His opponent was Daxor, a hulking Suliban brute with a reputation for ruthlessness. As they stepped into the ring, Daxor sneered down at him. "Ready to taste defeat, human?" Daxor snarled. Gerald said nothing, dropping into a fighting stance. The bell rang and Daxor charged, a blur of speed and strength. Gerald dodged and weaved, but Daxor's blows were too fast, too powerful. A punch slipped through Gerald's guard, slamming into his ribs. Another caught him on the jaw, snapping his head back. The crowd roared, smell of blood in the air. Gerald's vision blurred, legs shaking. He was being beaten into the ground. As Daxor loomed over him, fist raised for the final strike, something in Gerald snapped. He reached deep within himself, to the psionic power he had kept hidden for so long. The world seemed to slow. He could see the arc of Daxor's punch, predict its path. At the last second he swayed aside, the fist passing a hair's breadth from his face. Daxor stumbled, overextended. Gerald lashed out with a snap kick to the knee. Bone crunched. Daxor howled. But the Suliban kept coming, launching a frenzied barrage of strikes. Gerald flowed around them like water, moving with precognitive grace. He slipped past Daxor's guard and unleashed a devastating uppercut that lifted the massive Suliban off his feet. As Daxor crashed to the mat, Gerald stood over him, fist glowing with psionic energy. He thrust out his hand and an invisible wave blasted Daxor backwards, slamming him into the wall. The Suliban slid to the ground, unconscious. Silence fell over the arena, then erupted into chaos. Spectators screamed and pointed. Alara shot to her feet, face twisted with fury. Her father, General Zoran, looked on in astonishment. That's impossible, Zoran growled. No human could do that. The general's eyes narrowed as he studied Gerald. There's something unnatural about that boy. In the final challenge, Gerald raced through the gauntlet, psionic senses stretched to their limit. He sensed the traps before he saw them, leaping and dodging with superhuman agility. Holographic enemies fell before his telekinetic blasts. He was nearing the end when his danger sense screamed a warning. He hurled himself aside just as a hail of plasma bolts scorched the ground where he'd been standing. Real plasma, lethal levels. He caught a glimpse of Alara in the control booth, a cruel smile on her lips. She was trying to kill him. More bolts lanced towards him. Instinctively, Gerald thrust out his hands and projected a shimmering shield of psionic force. The plasma slammed against it, pushing him back, but he gritted his teeth and held firm. The crowd watched in stunned disbelief as he shrugged off the deadly fire and sprinted for the finish line. He stumbled across it and collapsed, utterly drained. Medics rushed to his side, scanners whirring. One of them recoiled in shock, turning to General Zoran. "Sir, the scans. They show illegal genetic modifications. This human has been enhanced far beyond legal limits." "I knew it!" Alara shrieked. "He's a cheat, a freak!" Zoran's face was thunderous. He motioned to his guards. "Place that creature under arrest. He will face a full inquiry and tribunal." As the guards dragged Gerald away, he met Alara's eyes. He saw shock there, and anger, but also fear. She had seen what he could do, a glimpse of humanity's true potential, and it terrified her. The Academy descended into an uproar. Earth diplomats lodged furious protests, demanding Gerald's release, but the Suliban were implacable. Gerald had revealed himself as an illegal abomination, and he would face their justice. He sat in his cell, listening to the distant shouting, and knew that the crisis had only just begun. His secret was out now, and the fragile peace between humanity and the Suliban was crumbling. Conflict was coming, and he would be at the center of it. His psionic abilities might be the only thing that could save his people, or doom them all. The cell door slid open with a hiss. Gerald squinted against the harsh light as two Suliban guards hauled him to his feet. They marched him down a sterile corridor to an interrogation chamber where General Zoran waited, flanked by scientists in crisp white uniforms. "Strap him in," Zoran ordered. Gerald gritted his teeth as they secured him to a metal chair. Electrodes were attached to his temples and chest. A scientist approached with a syringe. "This serum will lower your mental defenses," the alien explained clinically. "Resistance is inadvisable." The needle plunged into Gerald's arm. Almost immediately, his thoughts began to swim. He fought to maintain focus as Zoran leaned in close. "Now then, human, you will tell us everything about these genetic enhancements." Hours passed in a haze of probing questions and invasive scans. Gerald's mind and body were laid bare before Suliban science. When they finally finished, Zoran's expression was grim. "Such power in human hands is unacceptable," the general growled. "You will never set foot on Suliba." Meanwhile, on Earth, the corridors of power buzzed with frantic activity. Diplomats and military brass huddled in emergency meetings. "We must secure Gerald's release immediately," insisted Ambassador Chen. "The alliance hangs by a thread." "Perhaps we should come clean about the enhancement program," a general suggested. "Absolutely not," snapped the Secretary of Defense. "We'll stick to our story. Unauthorized experiment, no official sanction." But as days passed, evidence emerged that told a different tale. Classified documents, covert funding trails. The Suliban pieced together the truth, confronting Earth's leaders with mounting outrage. Then came the attack. Alarms blared through the Suliban command center. On the main view screen, a border colony erupted in flames. Massive Urbaz warships rained death from above. "Status report," Zoran barked. "Planetary defense is overwhelmed," an officer replied. "Urbaz ground forces have made planetfall." Zoran's eyes narrowed. He turned to his aide. "Bring me the human." Gerald stumbled as they shoved him before the general. His body still ached from days of interrogation. "Your freedom for your service," Zoran said without preamble. "Help us repel this attack and you walk free. Refuse, and you rot in that cell while your people burn alongside mine." Gerald met the general's gaze. "I'll fight." Within hours, he was on a dropship plummeting through the planet's atmosphere. Suliban's shock troops eyed him warily as they neared the landing zone. Gerald centered himself, drawing on his powers. They hit the ground running. Urbaz energy weapons lit up the smoky air. Gerald thrust out his hands, a shimmering psionic barrier materializing to shelter the Suliban troops. "Push forward!" he shouted. Gerald advanced, deflecting incoming fire. He reached out with his mind, sensing the Urbaz positions. With a grunt of effort, he telekinetically crushed a gun emplacement, sending aliens flying. A Urbaz tank rumbled into view, cannon swiveling towards them. Gerald's eyes blazed with power. The massive vehicle crumpled like paper, crushing its crew. "By the spirits," a Suliban soldier whispered. Gerald pressed on. He touched the minds of Urbaz soldiers, implanting confusion and terror. Entire squads turned on each other in panic. From her command post, Alara watched the battle unfold with increasing astonishment. The human she had once scorned was single-handedly turning the tide. When the smoke cleared, the colony was secure. But the cost had been grievous. Bodies littered the streets, human, Suliban, and Urbaz alike. Zoran surveyed the aftermath, his expression unreadable. He turned to Gerald. "It seems we have a common enemy after all. Perhaps there is a place for you here." In the days that followed, an uneasy new dynamic took shape. Earth and Suliba, their trust strained, but their need for alliance clear. And at the center of it all, Gerald found himself thrust into a new role. "Welcome to Nova Squad," Zoran announced. Before Gerald stood a mix of elite human and Suliban operatives. Among them was Alara, her face carefully neutral. "You'll be working closely together," the general continued. "The fate of both our peoples may well rest in your hands." Gerald met Alara's eyes across the room. Years of rivalry and mistrust hung between them. But as alarms sounded once more, herald of another Urbaz incursion, they knew the time for old grudges was past. Side by side, they moved out to face the threat. A new chapter in the war had begun. Gerald's team hurled themselves from the drop pods, hitting the ground running as they raced toward the Urbaz compound. The alien world's twin moons cast an eerie glow over the barren landscape. Gerald reached out with his mind, cloaking their approach in a psychic shroud that bent light and fooled sensors. "We're clear," he whispered over the comm. "Move in." They slipped past the outer defenses, Gerald's psionic abilities masking their presence. But as they breached the inner perimeter, all hell broke loose. Alarms blared and plasma bolts sizzled through the air. "Contact!" Alara shouted, diving for cover. Urbaz shock troopers poured from the compound, their insectoid forms overflowing with weaponry. Gerald thrust out his hands, telekinetic force smashing the first wave back. But more kept coming. "Fall back," he ordered. "Defensive formation." The team retreated, laying down covering fire. Gerald's mind raced, searching for a way out. Then he heard Alara's scream. She stumbled, plasma scoring a vicious burn across her torso. As she fell, time seemed to slow. Gerald saw the light fading from her eyes. Without thinking, he reached out and forged a psionic link. The connection slammed into place like a thunderbolt. Suddenly, he was in two bodies at once, feeling Alara's agony as his own. Gritting his teeth, he channeled his healing factor through the link. Alara gasped as the wound began to close, but the strain was immense. Gerald felt like his skull was splitting open. Still, he held on, willing her to live. With his free hand, he lashed out at the advancing Urbaz. Telekinetic blasts sent them flying. Others he froze in place, holding them immobile as his team gunned them down. Finally, the attack slackened. Gerald severed the link, swaying on his feet. Alara stirred, looking up at him in wonder. You saved me, she whispered. He nodded weakly, then turned to the others. We need to move, now. They fought their way to the extraction point, Gerald's powers clearing a path. As they lifted off, he scrolled through the stolen intel. His blood ran cold. My God, he breathed. They're building a weapon that could neutralize every psionic in human space. Alara's eyes widened. We have to stop them. Gerald nodded grimly. Whatever it takes. Weeks later, he emerged from the enhancement tanks, his body crackling with raw psionic energy. The scientists stepped back in awe as he demonstrated his new abilities, summoning psi-storms that could level cities. But the power came at a cost. After each use, Gerald collapsed, requiring hours in a regeneration chamber to recover. Still, he threw himself into the fight against the Urbaz. Victory after victory followed. Yet, with each triumph, Alara saw Gerald withdraw further into himself. The easy camaraderie they'd built crumbled. He became cold, focused only on the next mission. Now they raced to destroy the psionic disruption array before it came online. Their shuttle rocked with impacts as they neared the facility. 30 seconds, the pilot called. Gerald rose, face set in grim lines. Then an explosion rocked the ship. Alara watched in horror as his regeneration chamber sparked and died. Doesn't matter, Gerald growled. I'll finish this with or without it. As the ramp lowered, Alara grabbed his arm. Gerald, wait! You can't... He shrugged her off, striding into battle. Alara could only watch as he unleashed his full might, praying it wouldn't destroy him in the process. The figure loomed before her, familiar yet alien. Alara's heart raced as she studied the being that had emerged from the regeneration chamber. His physique was unmistakably Gerald's, yet his eyes held none of the warmth or recognition she desperately sought. Gerald? She ventured, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure's gaze fixed upon her, cold and analytical. That designation is known to me. You are Alara. We fought together. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Alara suppressed a shudder. Yes, we did. Do you remember anything else? The being that was once Gerald furrowed his brow, processing. Fragments, flashes of combat, the sensation of vast power coursing through my mind. He flexed his fingers, tiny arcs of psionic energy crackling between them. My abilities remain. Perhaps they have even grown stronger. Alara nodded, unsure how to proceed. This was Gerald, yet not Gerald. The scientists had warned her of this possibility, but facing the reality was jarring. The Urbaz threat has been neutralized, she said, searching for any hint of the man she once knew. Your sacrifice ensured our victory. Sacrifice, the being echoed. An interesting concept. I retain knowledge of its meaning, yet I feel no particular attachment to the act itself. He turned, surveying the medical bay with detached curiosity. What is my purpose now that the conflict has ended? Alara struggled to find an answer. The Gerald she knew had been driven by a deep sense of duty, a burning desire to protect both humanity and their Suliban allies. This new entity seemed to lack any such motivation. That's something we'll need to figure out together, she said carefully. Your abilities make you unique. There will always be a need for someone with your power. The being nodded curtly. Logical. I will require a full briefing on current galactic affairs and potential threats. As he strode past her towards the exit, Alara felt a pang of loss. The Gerald who had saved her life, who had fought alongside her with unwavering courage, was gone. In his place stood a living weapon, coldly efficient but stripped of the humanity that had made him a hero. She watched him go, wondering what the future held for this new incarnation of Earth's greatest psionic warrior. The war was over, but Alara feared that the true battle, the struggle to reclaim Gerald's soul, had only just begun.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.